Hello, freedom loving people, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast with Glenn and myself. Glenn is fresh off a trip from Ukraine. So much has been happening. Cannot wait to get into it. Got to talk leadership reshuffles with Fedorov out, maybe coming back in, protests in the street, some long range logistical strikes by the Ukrainians hitting land and sea targets. There's obviously Saudi Arabia if we leave the Russia Ukraine piece. Laura Loomer was in Ukraine. Don't know if you were there with her, Glenn. Can't wait to get started. But just before we hit record, you mentioned that there was some bad news today as well. So why don't we start there and then let's hear about your trip?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. And hi, Ryan. It's great to see you. Let's just start by expressing our condolences and the sorrow for the families of the lost. So there was a strike today in Bucha. My understanding is there was a UAV exhibition that was being conducted by the Ukrainians, and there were at least 60 casualties, according to the information I saw. Now, this is going back a couple of hours, so unfortunately, it's probably a higher count. At least 6 dead and 60 wounded. So those numbers, don't quote me, but any one dead or one casualty is a tragedy, and of course, this is multiplied. My understanding is the Ukrainian government's opening an investigation into how this happened, because I'm sure that there'll be a lot of turmoil in the Ukrainian government over this and society. There was an incident about a year ago where one of the military units was doing an award ceremony kind of in the open, and the Russians hit and killed a number of Ukrainian troops. I think they were cadets, if I remember correctly. And so some of my Ukrainian contacts are already referring to that tragedy and saying, that was, I think the commander of that unit was relieved and maybe put under investigation for negligence. And unfortunately, I think there will probably be an investigation into negligence to the organizers of this event. But we don't have all the facts. What we do know is the loss of any life is a tragedy. So unfortunately, we'll be praying for some Ukrainian families tonight. So,
absolutely. And in the last week, there were some American casualties in Iran. Obviously, we're always thinking about them. Several Army soldiers, an officer, some of them stationed in Germany where you and I were once upon a time, Glenn. So they're also in harm's way, and we're thinking about them.
Yeah, well said. And yes, God bless them. And for, again, the viewers, we have U.S. troops around the world on duty tonight, whatever time it is, wherever they are, they're standing watch, keeping us safer. And our former colleagues in the intelligence community.
That's right.
Law enforcement, stay in the line.
And you were just on the front line, Glenn. What was it like? So much going on in Ukraine in the past week.
Well, the big news is politically, President Zelensky fired the Minister of Defense, Fyodorov, who was young. He was considered, an innovator technology-wise. He had a strategy. If you remember, he was talking about inflicting up to 50,000 Russian casualties a month using the drone technology and AI, integrated systems, automated systems. He was removed by President Zelensky in response. My understanding is there was a conflict between him and General Syrskyi, the commander of the general staff. They had a disagreement on how to wage the war. The Minister of Defense was removed, Fyodorov, and then there was protests going back to, if you remember, when they tried to shut down NABU, the anti-corruption agency, last summer, and then there were public protests, and then the president kind of had to backtrack. And Syrskyi became a victim of all this. Then General Syrskyi was removed from his position. He was replaced by a guy by the name of General Tripathi, who's got a very good reputation. And the President Zelensky has offered Fyodorov, kind of as a consolation, a new position, I think a deputy prime minister position for innovation. The last I heard is that Fyodorov has said he's not going to take that position. He only will take the Minister of Defense job. So there's a lot of churn. The individual who was put in charge of the Ministry of Defense is a SBU officer. So that's the internal service. Great guy. I've had the fortune to meet him. But there's some angst because he's not from the military. Of course, Fyodorov wasn't from the military either. He was kind of like a tech innovator. And then my understanding is Rustam Umarov, who was the head of the National Security Council, who was leading all the negotiations with the U.S. and Russia, my understanding, he was removed. He's being replaced by the former chief of the national police. And as all this is going on, the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., who's been here probably less than a year, announced she's leaving for personal reasons. There's some media reporting that she's under investigation by NABU. And I heard one claim that Umarov is being offered the ambassadorship here in Washington. So there's a lot of churn going on. And I will say that a lot of the Ukrainians I know are a little bit upset, frustrated by this, because going into this, they were making some progress on the battlefield.
Very much so.
Yeah. And so people feel they're worried that this is shifting the narrative. It's giving the Russians something to kind of put their hooks into. Now, as all this is happening, going back to the unfortunate passage of Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator who was promoting the sanctions package. That package now, my understanding, I met with someone today in Washington who said that they have enough votes now to pass that package, even if the president doesn't support it, although the president came out and said he does support it. He wants to add Iran sanctions to that package, given what's happening in the Gulf and the fact that the MOU that we had with the Iranians turned out to be, as valuable as Iranian currency. So there's a lot going on. The sanctions package is probably this is my assessment, and it's going to be passed in probably the next couple of weeks. And I'm sure the Russians are very concerned about that. Marco Rubio met on the sidelines with Lavrov, who, like usual, tried to read a lecture to his American colleague and talked about this Anchorage agreement, which even Putin himself said there was no agreement. But Lavrov is still harping on that propaganda point. And, they also warned that it's unacceptable for the U.S. to be supplying the Ukrainians with certain types of weapons. Now, a highlight of the past week was that F-16, flown by Ukrainian pilots, shot down. It was the first air-to-air kill in the war. Shot down, I'm not sure what the nomenclature was of the Russian aircraft, but there was an air-to-air combat, and the Ukrainians came out on top. One of my Ukrainian contacts told me that the Russians are avoiding getting anywhere close to the front because they are afraid of the F-16s. And I think that's probably a good sign.
Yeah.
So what else is going on? All the political turmoil. I think this horrible event in Bucha will just add to that. I'm sure there'll be a lot of calls for resignations, accountability. And the mood among many Ukrainians is not great.
When you're over there, are you meeting with military, Glenn? Is it politicians, local? Like, what is that discussion like when all of this is happening? You have protests in the streets.
Well, this trip, it was a very short trip. Honestly, we just had meetings with some Ukrainian business people, but some Ukrainians I know, and then many conversations with a lot of the people that I know as all these things are going on. Because at the same time that this was happening, Laura Loomer, as you mentioned, is in Ukraine still, I think. She made a trip, interviewed President Zelensky. She's had meetings with a number of Ukrainians. She met with the chief rabbi in Kiev. I think she visited the Lavra, the probably the oldest Orthodox monastery in Ukraine, and by the way, older than anything in Russia, since Eastern Orthodoxy got its start. The Russian Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Orthodox Church, got its start in Kiev and Rus. And that trip is getting a lot of attention, and there's a lot of, some people criticizing Laura Loomer. One of the things I said, I posted this and some people attacked me for it, but I said, listen, it's very refreshing to hear someone admit that they were wrong, because she's openly saying she was wrong. And she's apologizing to the Ukrainians for misrepresenting or misunderstanding and misrepresenting publicly who was responsible for this conflict, who the aggressor is, and it's Russia. And she's admitted that she bought into the Russian propaganda. So for all the viewers out there, I would just say that, I think this is my own assessment, my own opinion, but it's very good that someone with a public profile like that is admitting that they were wrong about something, because you don't hear a lot of that these days from people. And people, politicians, leaders, And whether you like it or not, Laura Loomer is a leader in for some people. People listen to what she says, and she posted something about her meeting with Zelensky, and President Trump immediately responded. So the president of the United States, pays attention to what she says. She's an influencer, and she's got influence. So it's, I think, great to see for the Ukrainians. And for those of us that have argued all along that the Russians are the aggressors here, that she's admitting that she was wrong, and she's telling people to be very, very aware of the fact that there are a lot of Americans and people in the West who have bought into the Russian propaganda.
I would agree that it's good that she shared that this had happened. I mean, the concern is for the year or two where she was on the other side believing the propaganda, she does have a lot of influence within the MAGA movement. President Trump does respond to some of her posts. You just hope that didn't unduly influence decisions that put the Ukrainians at a disadvantage over time. But to own up to it, I have a ton of respect for that. And I love that the Ukrainians jumped on this opportunity. They could have very easily turned their back. They've leveraged it to their advantage, which they absolutely should. And that is a good news story, I think, in the end.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, Ryan, I mean, you bring up a good point, and I'm sure decisions were made that were based on some things that she had influence. But as I've tried to explain to people, like, we shouldn't assume that everybody has the background that you and I had. We had a big advantage. We both kind of grew up in the foreign policy world.
That's true.
We both worked overseas. We were able to study foreign languages. We were able to, interact with foreigners, in different countries. And our job was to follow all these issues. And there are a lot of people now that are super critical of people like Laura Loomer, who I think forget the fact that they were very privileged to have that opportunity. Now, they earned it. In many cases, you were. I know you earned it, in the military and in the agency. But still, we need to be a little bit forgiving, in my opinion, and remember that people are learning all the time. I mean, and she's admitting, I'm learning. And one of the things I'm seeing, which is a little bit disgusting in the dialogue in the media now, is some people accusing her of being an Israeli spy. She's being funded by Mossad. This is all, people are making this, she's an agent. She was being paid to go to Ukraine by the Ukrainians. To my knowledge, no, that's not the case. I think she funded her own trip, and she went there because she wanted to see firsthand, which I also applaud. There are a lot of people that are like, not Monday morning quarterback, but sitting back in studios, podcasting very comfortably, that have not been there, and they're commenting in whether it's LinkedIn or whatever the social media outlets are. Who've never made the effort. So she made the effort, and good for her, and good for the people that organized it. And yes, I agree with you. The Ukrainians, they could have easily said no. She criticized President Zelensky, and he met with her, and that's good. So
excellent. You mentioned the Anchorage agreement that's not actually an agreement. And now I think that Peskov said that Russia will be waiting on the U.S. proposal instead. This, just having read Midnight in Moscow by Ambassador Sullivan, it just seems so common. Glenn, I'd love to get your take on this. The way that the Russians will harp on small pieces of diplomatic language and use that to their advantage. Ambassador Sullivan brings it up, not just Soviet times, but the Minsk II Accords that kind of preceded the run-up to this invasion, the special military operation in 22, and how Russia and Ukraine came to this agreement with the Minsk II dialogue. And eventually, Ukraine didn't sequence the events in the way that Russia suggested that they should, and therefore Russia didn't feel the need to abide by their part of the agreement and could then say that Ukraine had violated the agreement. It seems like they're harping on the Anchorage Accord, or not Accord, the Anchorage discussion that they had in August of last year, and using it when it suits them. It seems to be so frustrating. I can only imagine you've seen this many times from your career.
We've talked about this on one of the earlier programs. What's frustrating for me is that I think some of the people that are negotiating with the Russians now don't have that background. They don't know the Russians repeat the same things over and over again. They have a style of negotiation which, they'll go on the offensive right away. They get aggressive, they attack. I've been in negotiations with, Ambassador Sullivan at one point in my career, and he saw it firsthand how they do things. They get aggressive, and then they try and be friendly. They play kind of good cop, bad cop. They go into like such minute detail to try and derail like the overall discussion to get what they want or to manipulate. And they go back, they harp on history. I tell people this all the time. Like they would argue about things to go back to the 1800s,
Yes.
right? And if you don't know that history, I've seen this over and over again with American interlocutors on, negotiations. They just get lost and they give up. It's kind of the way I argue with my wife. I just throw stuff in there and I try and wear her down, right? So no, I don't do that. No. Okay, maybe. But they make accusations, they make all kinds of crazy claims. And again, like look at Lavrov. He's, his own president said there was no agreement in Anchorage, and yet he's repeating it again. Probably what Peskov is referring to as Rubio said, look, we're ready to try and re-engage to get the negotiations going again because we want this war to end, and we're looking for new solutions. There's going to have to be a new approach here, right? And of course, the Russians sit back and say, okay, what's your new approach? And then we're going to pick it apart. And by the way, we had an agreement in Anchorage. You're not abiding by that agreement. Even though a couple weeks ago, our president admitted there was no. By the way, we didn't, like, Wagner weren't our guys. It was a private military company. Although, yes, our president admitted we were funding them and recruiting them, right? I mean, you can go through example after example where the Russians say one thing and then eventually it comes out that they were lying.
It's so annoying and predictable. Like that, just even reading the book, it made me so frustrated. Like the ambassador going back and forth with these people, different interlocutors, and you just knew what they were coming with and that they weren't, playing by the same rules. Okay, I want to get your take, Glenn. If Fedorov is out right now, there's a replacement as defense minister. Syrskyi is out. We have a replacement for him as well. What are your thoughts on the ability of the Ukrainian military and their industrial complex to be able to sustain some of the battlefield wins they have right now with this shakeup taking place?
Yeah, I mean, it's not great that this is all happening because people are afraid to make decisions, right? That's just normal when you have shakeups like this. But I will say this is just my 1,000-mile view assessment of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian culture and the mentality. Ukrainians are very, very independent minded. They are very much like Americans this way. They're almost like at the local level. The municipalities, the local commanders have a lot of, they're just very independent minded, and they don't necessarily abide by the rule of the central government, or they're not inclined to always ask for permission. There's a very big difference between them and the Russians. The Russians are very centralized. It's top down. The Ukrainians, a lot of the commanders and a lot of the units are locally funded in many cases. They are Ukrainian businesses, Ukrainian organizations have been helping them financially. They're helping them buy weapon systems. They're building a lot of their own munitions, right? They're procuring them. They have a lot of authority at the kind of tactical or maybe operational level. And so I don't think that these changes are going to completely undermine what's happening on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are going to keep doing what they're doing. I think the bigger risk is that the Russians, and we've said this before, the Russians find countermeasures to some of the things that the Ukrainians are doing. And so the Ukrainians, one Ukrainian has described something to me on the battlefield, which is like, if those of you remember Mad Magazine, spy versus spy, right? And this is what I've seen with the Russians in my career. I wrote an article about this like 2 years ago. Don't underestimate the Russians. You come up with something that works against them, and then they come up with a countermeasure. And so the Ukrainians are very aware of that. They're well aware of it. But the reality is that some of the things that the Ukrainians have been doing in the last few months that have been very successful may be counter. I'll give you an example. There are rumors, by the way, I was unable to confirm this, but there are rumors that the Russians were hacking Starlink because, Starlink made the wise decision to cut off the illegal unregistered Starlink terminals that were operating in Russia. But some people are claiming that the Russians have come up with the alternative, or that they're hacking Starlink terminals and using them again, which is problematic in the drone space. right? And like,
Definitely.
so for command and control. So that's a danger. I'm sure if you're on the front and you see all this turmoil, political turmoil in Kiev, it's not great. But then again, I think people are probably used to it, and the consequences of letting up are so serious that I don't think that they're going to let up.
So I'm pretty disappointed that we saw this schism happen, basically, between the leaders from the defense ministry and basically the commander in chief of the armed forces. I mean, they really are having sustained success. It's not perfect, but it is quite good. The impasse that they have come to must have been so substantial, and it went not just to like, are we going to push harder for advanced technology, which I think is a simplified way of saying it, but who's going to control contracts? Where do they flow? Are we going to spend more on drones or more traditional military equipment? Sierski has come from a far more traditional background, older, instrumental in the defense of Kiev, I think, at the outset of the war. Fedorov is 35 years old, as you mentioned, very young. Tripathi, to his credit, the person who's now the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, made his name in Mariupol, it looks like, in 2014. Very much a mechanized armor officer, it seems like. Armored column broke through a separatist barricade to secure Ukrainian troops. He had another event where he was encircled with 30 vehicles and ended up getting out of a Russian attack. And you mentioned earlier, I wonder if this is him. He resigned last year in June after a Russian strike killed 12 soldiers at a Kiev training facility. And personally took responsibility, which again, I think is a big deal for someone to do. Zelensky, to his credit, kept him in operational roles. He allowed him to resign from that position, but kept him in operational roles. Fast forward a year, he's now leading this effort. So I think he has support of the troops, but I am really disappointed at that high level that there was such an impasse that they could not collaborate any further. I'm sure you've seen it, Glenn, at the highest levels of government that you operated in, but it is pretty sad to see from the outside.
Well, I remember when I was in the agency and you wouldn't even talk to me. I'd walk by in the cafeteria, right? You just like walk right by me. So,
You had such a reputation. I didn't want to be tainted.
Yeah. Look, Ryan, I mean, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of competition in any bureaucracy. I think, by the way, I have to say this, Sierski, he's painted as being this kind of dinosaur. But I was just talking to someone yesterday who said, look, he was one of the first guys that came to the manufacturers of some of the automated systems, the drones systems, and said, this is what I need. This is what we need on the front. So we can save lives if you guys can build this. And this one guy said he was like our inspiration. So it's not like he completely ignored, that's one of the narratives that's being pushed out there. There is a divide. I've seen this for the last couple of years, between what they call the generals or the officers that were trained kind of going back to Soviet times, they call the old Soviet style thinking, and then the new modern, innovative thinking. I was at a dinner, this is back in April, where there were people from both sides. And there was a general who I really respect, who's the guy's a hero. I mean, the Russians tried to kill him twice. He was wounded twice. He led the clearing of Kharkiv in 2022. He was saying, look, all this technology is great, but you don't win wars only by technology. You have to pay attention to the troops. You have to make sure, and by the way, you can't take territory with drones, robots. Now, other people are arguing, yeah, you can, right? And by the way, we don't have much of a choice because they still have a problem with conscription. I think that was another one of the issues that came up between the Minister of Defense and the commander of the general staff. They've had challenges implementing reforms to improve issues with conscription. One of the issues they've had is troops, and I'll say this because it's important for Americans to understand, troops were leaving the front lines because morale in some units would get bad because they felt like they didn't have the support, not of Kiev, but of Washington. And they were worried that they didn't have the ammunition, They didn't have the systems that they needed to keep fighting. And as one guy said to me, like, why would I go to the front if I know when I get there, I'm not going to have ammunition? And I always go back to this one conversation I had with the commander of the Naval Ground Forces. They were basically Marines in 2023, when he told me how his unit in the beginning of the war, they were outgunned, outnumbered by the Russians, and morale was, he said, until the first javelin showed. He said, and when we saw like the Americans were providing us with javelins, morale went, it hit the roof. And my guys felt like there was nothing that could stop us. So that inspiration of knowing that we're behind them is very critical. Now, if we look at what's going on right now, Zelensky had a good meeting with Trump in Ankara. President Trump came out and said he was going to support Lindsey Graham's sanctions package. I think criticism of Zelensky and the Ukrainians has died down a great deal. And so this is just a bad time to lose that momentum, I think.
That's right.
Because what I'm concerned is people are going to say, well, look, like they don't have their own house in order.
That's exactly what they're going to say. And I'm sure the Russians are going to amplify that.
Right.
Sadly.
Yeah. Now, what people need to remember is the Russians' house is in order only because Putin has a gun to everyone's head.
That's a good point. Well said. How about we pivot?
Let's pivot. Because who was in the White House last week? You know, big news. President Aoun, the Lebanese president.
I did see that. Yeah.
He was in Washington. He met with President Trump. That's, I think, the first time since maybe the 90s that a Lebanese president has been in the White House. Maybe I could get it wrong. Maybe it's like early 2000s, mid 2000s. But big news, all part of the effort to find a peace agreement. And President Trump said he's ready to meet with Hezbollah if it helps convince Hezbollah to disarm, which is no president has ever offered that before. It's way out of the box thinking, but hey, why not? It's an interesting thought. So
what's the likelihood of them disarming, you think, Glenn?
Their backs are against the wall. I think they were feeling a little emboldened in the last couple of weeks when we had this MOU with the Iranians, because they thought that they had survived and that they were going to come out on top again. But now that the shooting has started again and operations are happening again against the Iranians, I think they're really worried. One of the things President Trump said was, we'll let the Syrians, we'll let al-Shara deal with Hezbollah. That is super sensitive for many Lebanese because, the Assad regime for years occupied and tortured the Lebanese. People shouldn't forget that. Assad and before him, his father created all kinds of problems in Lebanon. And there's sensitivity that, the Syrians, when they say like al-Sham, like the Levant, what's the translation? Like the Levant, the Iranian, as many Syrians think that includes like Syria, Lebanon is part of Syria. So they have territorial ambitions. Mm-hmm. I think what President Trump was probably saying is we're going to get the Syrians to completely cut off the lines of communication between Tehran and southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is based. But
that would be great. Yeah.
That would be great. And I think the Syrians had been trying to do that. But there were still people saying, about 2 months ago, somebody was telling me, who was in the know, that the Iranians were still smuggling stuff through Syria to Hezbollah. And I think we've talked about this before too, but when the shooting started again, the Iranian or the Hezbollah guys all of a sudden had FPV drones that were causing the Israelis all kinds of problems. And I think that this, my sense is it caught a lot of people off guard. And that tells me that those rat lines were still working.
So are you optimistic after the meeting at the White House?
I think it's great that the president received President Aoun. That's a very strong message to the Lebanese people. By the way, they also talked about opening direct air flights between the U.S. and Lebanon. Those were ended after a TWA flight, and now I'm dating myself.
That has to be a long time ago.
Yeah. So the U.S. in response, I think it was in the 80s, the U.S. ended all air flights between Lebanon and the United States. Well, there's talk now. I think President Trump said we're going to reallow those flights. And many people in the Lebanese community here and many people in Lebanon love to hear that because there's a connection, right? It'll ease travel, probably help with commerce to some degree. Am I optimistic? There's a lot. I mean, this is a super complicated issue. And the president at one point made some quip that, why can't the Israelis solve this? It should be easy. All due respect to our president, that Lebanon is one of the most complicated issues I ever dealt with in my career, and it's not simple. There's so much nuance. We have an opportunity. I think the Lebanese people, the Lebanese state has a very unique opportunity that was pretty much given to them by the Israeli operations after 7 October, when Hezbollah stupidly joined the attack against Israel, and they paid a huge price. So the Lebanese state has an opportunity to demonstrate its legitimacy. They're going to need some help. And I think President Trump said we're going to help them. But what does that mean? Right? Training side by side with the Lebanese armed forces, intelligence support, funding. I think one of the things, I was talking to somebody today downtown about this, one of the things that really is needed is the U.S. needs to commit to helping rebuild parts of Lebanon, which have been devastated, including in the south, where Hezbollah traditionally has its stronghold. Because one of the reasons Hezbollah became so strong is the Iranians pump money in to build infrastructure, schools, social services that the Lebanese state couldn't provide after the civil war to the Shia community. And someone needs to do that, and it shouldn't be Iran, not the current regime, and it should not be Lebanese Hezbollah. It should be the Lebanese state with the help of the U.S. and maybe some of our allies, my opinion. Because I think when people start seeing that their schools are being rebuilt, hospitals are being rebuilt, they'll be appreciative, and they will not want to undermine, the social stability, which they desperately need, right?
Well, that's one proxy group there, Hezbollah. The Houthis now, there were some reports that Iran somehow got them drones, gold, unconfirmed reports, but the Houthis then have taken shots at Saudi tankers. They've effectively restricted some of the travel through Bab el-Mandeb. You've got 2 choke points in the Middle East, and if you just look at a map, if you can't go through those transit points, you're going all the way around Africa to reach Asia. Future prices for crude are, hit over 100 in the past 2 days. So that's heating up again. But Glenn, I really want to get your take on the Saudi nuclear agreement.
Again, another super complicated issue. I am not against the idea of signing an agreement like that with the Saudis. I mean, I give this administration credit for paying a lot of attention to the Gulf countries, who are very important players now in many regions. Money from the Gulf is doing a lot around the world. And, I was just out in Abu Dhabi and Dubai a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the people that I dealt with, very, very smart, very well educated, innovative. And they're playing a role in a lot of regions, in Africa, North Africa. The Chinese were hovering around the Saudis and the Emiratis when relations between Washington and those countries was strained. I think the previous administration made some mistakes early on when they came to power. They've allowed themselves to personalize some of the relationships. The former president said some things which were not really well received by the Gulf leaders, and that definitely has an impact. This administration, the first place President Trump went was the Gulf, right? Now, I think he sees the value, and probably the administration realizes we can't let our competitors push us out of those, the region. So going back to this deal, this was something the Saudis have wanted. Okay, I think it's good. Now, the president then came out and said, but this is all contingent on the Abraham Accord. You would think that would have been agreed to before you make an announcement. Maybe it was. Maybe this is all theatrics. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to comment because I'm not on the inside. I don't really know. But it's not a great look if we hadn't hashed all that out. And you can't, no country likes to make an agreement with you and then have you come out publicly and say, oh, by the way, as part of the agreement, we want this. we're going to expect this, which that country hadn't agreed to. That makes sense.
And for people who aren't as familiar with the Abraham Accords, obviously recognizing Israeli statehood, normalizing relations with Israel, but it doesn't preclude a separate path for Palestinian statehood, which Saudi Arabia has come out and said that that is important to them. So it's not like it's a blocker for that, but it's probably not easy for Saudi Arabia to publicly come out and recognize Israel in this way.
Right.
This is going to be pretty contentious, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't forget that the Abrams Accord, which was the first Trump administration, they pushed this concept. They made a lot of progress. My recollection is the Biden administration came to office and they kind of didn't pursue this because it was a Trump thing, which was a mistake. I think they very quickly learned or realized, you probably, this was a good thing for everybody, not just, one presidency and not another. But by the time they did that, I think the Iranians were in a position with Hamas to try and disrupt all of this. I think that was one of the goals, is my own assessment, of the 7 October attack. And that definitely created all kinds of problems, put the Accords on the back burner, or, put them at risk. So I think what the president is trying to do, that's been known for a while. He wants those countries to recognize, Israel, have a better relationship, have some kind of alliance. I think he probably people see that the Gulf countries and Israel are bulwarks for the United States in the Middle East. We're friends with both, and we want them all to get along. It can maybe very simple terms. And as you point out, the concept was not to deny the Palestinians also a state. I think this is one of the reasons why the Iranians were so threatened by it, and I think they were trying to undermine it with their allies from the very beginning.
Are we thinking President Trump had to add that additional contingency on there to placate Israel in this case? Because I would assume nuclear capability in Saudi Arabia, especially without all the the gold standard that people refer to that was in place with the UAE, might be somewhat threatening to Israel.
Yeah, it's possible. It's a good point. And as you point out, what I've heard is that, yes, we left out a lot of the controls, the oversight mechanisms that other people wanted. And to the credit of the Biden administration, what I understand is when they were dealing with the Saudis on this, they included those kind of demands. So I don't know. I would say this is that it's not a great look. And I'm sure the Saudis are now perplexed. And I hope it doesn't tank the whole idea. So
there was another report today. It sounds like officials in the administration who had been briefed on some U.S. intelligence had shared with reporters that this U.S. intel assessment believes that Mujtaba is more inclined to build a nuclear weapon now than his father was, and than he was in the past, which I don't think is a huge surprise given what has been done to him and the country. But this is it's a little more credible now as an intel assessment.
All along, my view has been that we needed to take action before it got out. The Iranians got too far. What we need to do next is going to be very challenging. By the way, Rubio, when he was at the ASEAN conference, pointed out to everybody, the Iranians trying to control and charge fees for passage to the Strait of Hormuz will set a horrible precedent. And it can't, we and our allies can't let that happen. Of course, I'm sure he's referring to what might happen in the Asia Pacific region when between the Taiwan Straits, what the PRC may try and do. So super, super complicated.
Absolutely. And then maybe just rounding out something we reported on last time, these Russian intel officers who are housed up in Japan. The one who was named in that report has subsequently left Japan, no surprise, probably back in Russia. Do you think they send them to the front lines, Glenn? What happens when you go back to, I mean, you've been outed publicly. Probably doesn't look good when you go back home.
Well, I mean, no, remember, what was her name? The one woman that got arrested here.
Yeah.
deals. She ended up having a TV show and she became a member of
All
parliament.
right, you're right. You're right on that
Right.
one.
So I don't think they'll probably send him to the front. Who knows what they'll do with him? I'm sure he's annoyed because probably living in Tokyo was great. Uh, it beats being in Saratov. I don't think that they'll they're not going to punish him for that. As I said to some people, like what I thought was funny is like all the noise this made. Oh, like they're using this cover position for Aeroflot. I'm like, right. Years ago, when I was still a college student, I was visiting somebody in DC and I was walking down the street with another friend in Georgetown, and there were 3 Aeroflot pilots and they're in uniform walking down the street. And I said something to one of them in Russian, then they like stopped and they said hello. And we started talking in Russian a little bit. And then as they walked away, my friend said, like, they all must be KGB. I mean, come on. Like, he's like, what are you talking?
Even you knew back then.
He's like, what are you talking to those guys for? In fact, it was like, think about it. That was when there was a summit. It was Gorbachev was in town and Reagan was meeting with Gorbachev. And I remember on the old executive building, there was a huge Soviet flag and a U.S. flag. So, hey, one other thing we should probably talk about, and we really need to do this, is India. There's big protests going on in India right now. And I really don't know all the background, but I'm going to find somebody for us to come on and talk about India.
Okay.
Another like critical country for many, many reasons: trade, defense, geopolitically.
I'm going to transition to Wildberries, which admittedly I had never heard of. This is like the Amazon of Russia. Embarrassingly, did not know what this was until the Ukrainians started targeting it pretty deliberately in the past 2 weeks to quite a bit of success, targeting some of their warehouses and specifically tying it to dual use items that could be used in drones or other military technology. But again, this is like their Amazon that delivers consumer products around the country. Obviously, Russia's coming out and saying, well, this is used for just consumer products. It's not military use. It's not dual use. You're targeting civilian infrastructure. I have no question that the Ukrainians are targeting dual use stuff with this. The question I wanted to ask you, though, Glenn, is the way you know Russia, is there a certain target like Wildberries or some other maybe dual use area, if the Ukrainians struck it, that would strike a match in Russia and drive more support for the Russian war and saying like, hey, this is over the line for us. Ukraine, you cannot target this. It's truly like going to bring them into the war and in support of Russia more.
Great question. Well, just off the top of my head, my assessment is not unless the Ukrainian, actually even like not even Ukrainians, because we've had that. We had it in Kursk. But if NATO forces entered Russian territory, that would be a red line, I think, for many Russians. That would block and unify people. I think what the Ukrainians were trying to do is like send a message to the Russian people, like, you're not isolated from this. Like, you're going to be
Exactly.
this, right? You're being affected by this. I have no doubt that the Russians use like Wildberry to move dual use technology, even maybe military goods. I mean, they everything in Russia is at the beck and call of the military and of the security services. They do what they're told to do. They don't have a choice. And the government uses all kinds of mechanisms to advance its. By the way, did you know that during the Soviet times, the Soviets used to, when they looked at like numbers of military forces, they used to count the postal service as part of, the U.S. military capability, right?
Hey,
like
rain, sleet, snow, they're going to make it.
Okay, now I have to say
They're all
this.
weather.
I have to say this. When I was a kid, my brothers will support me on this, including your neighbor there in California. We had the best mailman ever. His name was Wade. He was a Korean War veteran from the Marine Corps. Great guy. We loved him. I don't know if anybody in his family's out there, but I don't even know his last name. But he was the best mailman ever. He would come to the house and spend time talking about history and tell jokes from my head. I would sit in the kitchen with my parents, tell jokes, have a drink or two, which is probably couldn't get away with it anymore. Lemonade. He used to come to the house and be like, he'd knock on the door, and I'd open the door in the summertime when I was home from school. He'd say, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" I'd say, "How are you, sir?" He'd be like, "Well, it's kind of hot out here, kind of parched." I'm like, "Oh, would you like a glass of water? You have anything more tasty? Like, help out, help out, some lemonade. Oh, that'd be great, but maybe something a little bit different." And it'd progress up, and then it'd be like, well, he'd say, I think your mother has a bottle of scotch in the cabinet. Is just for me.
No way.
She did.
No way.
She did, yes. But anyway, going back to the Russians, everything inside of Russia, one of the reasons they mirror image, and they thought that everything in the United States was, part of the U.S. defense industrial complex, because a lot of, like in Russia, it was. And so, reminds me of the Yakov Smirnov joke. He said, in Soviet Union, in the United States, you say your mother wears combat boots. In Soviet Union, she probably does. You don't remember that joke? Yakov Smirnov, he was one. But by the way, if there are any mothers out there wearing combat boots, I wasn't saying that in a negative way. It could be very fashionable.
It could be fashionable. We wouldn't know.
We wouldn't know. But it's clear that the Russians, by the way, struck back hard right after that. And so and that's the mentality, eye for an eye. Now,
that's right.
They're complaining that the Ukrainians hit a civilian target. Well, hello. I mean, the Russians have been hitting civilian targets since the beginning of this.
Churches, schools. Yeah.
And by the way, I had never heard of Wildberries either. I never heard of it either.
Yeah, that was news. I literally thought they were talking about a warehouse of fruit when I saw it at first, embarrassingly.
I thought it was like a music group.
No. Wow. The Wildberries factory.
Yeah. Anyway.
Hey, I got a couple polymarket items wanted to get your take on real quick. So, Russia-Ukraine ceasefire agreement by the end of August. What are the odds, you think, that it could happen?
Do I have to give like a percent? I don't do polymarket. Do I have to give a percentage or?
Yeah, percent. Percent that you think that could happen.
15 to 20.
Oh, all right. It's sitting at 11. A little more pessimistic. Then by the end of the year, though, Russia-Ukraine ceasefire by the end of this year,
75%.
42%. So you think it's more likely, Glenn, that you might see that?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. And just again, like, we are not financial analysts. We're not suggesting you go and bet on this.
Yeah.
That is an interesting take. Can I just ask, what is driving that for you?
I just think that I've been saying this for a while, that I think that we're getting to that point where the Russians are feeling enough pain that they're going to have to make some concessions. And the Ukrainians have been saying for a while they want to end this thing. There's growing pressure. So, and then there are some other factors going into it as well. So.
I hope that does happen. And then China invading Taiwan by the end of September is 2%. So
yeah,
there's a lot of volume on that. A couple million being bet on that right now, which sounds silly.
Yeah, I'm with that. I'd say 2% is fair.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, you live in California. You're close to the issue.
0% on that one.
0%.
No chance.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the only way it could happen is a fluke, right?
What'd we miss, Glenn? Anything?
I don't know, Ryan. I think we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Great. We got a great one coming up next week too. Great guest. Going to go deep on Russia. You and this guest will know better than most.
In this guest, you and me in this guest.
That's right. That's right.
He is a great guy. We'll tell you the story of how I know him and what we have in common. Peter, but he is.
Can't wait.
Yeah, we're very fortunate. He's now professoring at Columbia, which is awesome. So, and I had the opportunity to go speak to his class in the spring, which was a lot of fun.
Excellent.
And when we'll tell you the backstory of how we know each other, kind of.
All right.
What the connection is. And then, yeah, we have some other great stuff coming up. And
that's right.
Don't forget to hit like.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. And if you have comments or questions, please. Just don't comment on my hair today, because I was working out, and then I realized I was like, I have 10 minutes before the podcast. So I ran, jumped in the shower, and then ran through some clothes on. And yes, I am wearing pants, for those of you that may be asking.
Sure, everybody's asking. That was on everyone's mind.
I don't think most people care, honestly. They're probably like, please, like, just they don't want to
Well,
think
let's
about it.
just keep it above the waist. All right.
You don't want to
All
think
right. You
about
have a good weekend, Glenn. Thank you.
it. All right, Ryan.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.